From the nation's capital, the Conservative Caucus presents Conservative Roundtable, an in-depth look at today's most important issues.
Welcome to Conservative Roundtable. I'm Howard Phillips, chairman of the Conservative Caucus, which sponsors these broadcasts. Our special guest for this broadcast is my good friend, Jon Utley. Jon is a widely experienced man. He's been a broadcaster for U.S. information services of various kinds. He's a successful realtor, a successful businessman. He's very knowledgeable in developments in Latin America, but that's not why he's here. Jon had the opportunity within the last couple of years to visit a concentration camp where his father was executed by the communists. Jon, tell us about Jon Utley. Tell us about your mother and about your father.
Well, I guess I was born in 1934. My father was arrested in Russia, in Moscow. My mother was English, my father Russian. My father was arrested in 1936. The secret police came in the middle of the night, 2 o'clock at night, and spent the hours going through their papers, and then he was arrested. My mother never saw him again.
What was the claim on which he was arrested?
She never was given any reason officially, that they were just investigating. But later we found papers, which I'll go into, how we found the documents from the police, the Russian police, which are still available. And they said for being accused of being a Trotskyist, which was one of the things that Trotsky-Stalin.
Trotsky, of course, was a principal rival of Stalin for control of the Soviet Union following the death of Lenin.
Right. And in that time, they were arresting. They called people Trotskyists, but in actuality, they were arresting many, many people who had international experience. You know, 2 years later, the Russians, Stalin executed most of the military general staff of his own army. And my father traveled abroad. He'd been in many foreign countries. He was very international, and they were really eliminating a lot of those people.
He was of Polish heritage, was he not?
Well, it was that era of born in Odessa, which was Russia, really. Mm-hmm. It was Russian. I mean, but it was Poland and Russia were mixed very close.
Your mother was of Swedish?
No, English.
And there was no...
No.
So she was English all the way.
Yeah.
And she was well known to British socialists. As a matter of fact, when your father was imprisoned, she appealed to people like George Bernard Shaw, Bertrand Russell, others.
Her father had been a socialist in England, and she was, and knew the Webbs in those times.
Beatrice and Sidney Webb were the founders of the Fabian Society, which had a strategy of the gradual implementation of socialism.
Right. And then when my father was arrested, she got out. She kept her British citizenship so she could travel. A Russian could not travel without government permission. And she got a petition signed by leading English intellectuals, including Bernard Shaw and Bertrand Russell and others, a letter to Stalin asking for my father's release. And I never knew what happened, but later we got the documents from the Russian police, the FSB, which is the successor of the KGB. And in the files is the copy of the letter to Stalin. It's,
what did Stalin have to say in
well,
response?
he never answered. But we have that up on a website. My mother's name, FredaUtley.com, FredaUtley. And we have the letter on the website and all this information, in particular, that these files are still there. The Soviet system was very meticulous, and legalistic isn't quite the word, but they kept records of everything. And there were, I saw with my father's arrest and condemnation, there were 3 officers signing off, and they had a little hearing that might take 2 or 3 minutes, but anyway, all these papers are still there in the files. And
your mother began her political life as a socialist, but she became a very famous anti-communist in the United States.
Later, after my father was arrested, but before that, she lived in Russia for 7 years with my father and saw what communism had become. And then she escaped with me in 1936.
How old were you?
I was 2 years old.
So at the age of 2, you left Russia.
And at 5, came to America in 1939. And it's always timing. The ship we came on was a Dutch ship that was bombed. 3 weeks later, it was sunk in Rotterdam. So
you were there while it still floated.
Yeah, fortunately. Timing, as they say,
timing is everything.
Important.
Yeah. Well, what happened after your mother renounced socialism?
Well, she wasn't at first. She was afraid for my father that he was in prison to say things against the communists. And then after two or 3 years, she couldn't keep it quiet, and she wrote a major book in 1940 called The Dream We Lost, about Russia. And in those days, you can't think today, especially young people with the media everywhere, what it was, a closed society. There was no journalists there. Everything was secret. And as I learned when I visited the camps in northern Russia, 2 of the big former concentration camps, and there was no communication between one camp and another. They were broken into sub-camps.
But tell us more about your mother before we leave that. She came to the United States in what year?
In 1939, came here. But she had been, actually, after my father was arrested, she escaped, left Russia, and in 1937 went to China for British newspapers and was a correspondent on the war front with the Chinese and Japanese war. And then from there she came to America through Seattle and loved America. All the ideals she'd had as a communist, if you will, of how you say, equality in the best sense of the word, and opportunity and freedom, she found in America, if you will. Of course, communism became the absolute opposite. And she loved America. And then in 39 we came. I was in England. She'd left me there, and in 39 we came to her.
Who cared for you while your mother was away?
Some friends of hers.
How did she earn a living in America?
Well, as a writer, and then it was very hard. She wrote a major article opposed to entry into the war.
World War II.
World War II.
On what theory?
On the theory that Stalin and Hitler should be left to destroy each other.
I had a Latin teacher who said the same thing.
Many said that. And the Roosevelt administration was trying to get us into the war and didn't like that. And after the article came out in the Reader's Digest, they gave her 48 hours to leave the country. And
Franklin Roosevelt wanted her to leave America.
Yes, sir. And then through that, there came a bill was introduced in Congress by Congressman Voorhees, who's known because he's the one Nixon replaced.
Jerry Voorhees was the Democrat who Richard Nixon defeated in 1946.
But he was anti-communist, among other things, and he introduced a bill in Congress. With that, we could stay in the country. So
and it passed?
It passed later. It took 4 or 5 years.
It did?
Yeah.
And so you were in limbo during that period?
Yeah, but we were here in America.
It was uncertain.
Once the whole thing is getting to America.
Well, your mother's book became very popular in conservative circles.
Well, The Dream We Lost about Russia was read by many important people who, it was a time when there wasn't much known about Russia, and that it explained particularly how the system worked, the economic, the corruption, the waste, above all, the incredible waste in the communist system.
Well, your mother met some very interesting people in America. I recall you telling me that as a boy, you would be sitting there as your mother played cards with Gene Kirkpatrick.
Well, that was
among others.
Later, yeah, we had a poker game every Saturday. I used to play too.
How did your mother come to meet all of these people?
Well, she was a leader of the anti-communists in the 1940s. You have to think there were very few. In the early 50s, very few people were opposed. And the communist, in a sense, her friends' influence was dominant in the intellectual world. And it was a small group on the outside.
Of course, Jean Kirkpatrick and her husband, Kirkpatrick, were Humphrey Democrats. And Hubert Humphrey was an anti-communist liberal.
And they became, and the labor movement in America was anti-communist.
Wayne Kirkland, George Meany.
Yeah, was an important part of the...
Jay Lovestone, they were very strong anti-communists.
Very much, and they brought Solzhenitsyn here to speak when the business community wouldn't.
I remember George Meany hosted Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and I've been delighted to see that Solzhenitsyn has begun to regain favor with the Russian people. And his book, First Circle, is now being broadcast all over Russia.
It is, and we hear Russia there are problems in the government clamping down a bit, but there still is great freedom. And for example, in my case, we got these documents were sent to us through the Russian embassy. The FSB, the successor of secret police, facilitated getting all these documents. I got a picture of my father. Better than any picture my mother had is the mugshot from the police, which was in the files for, what, 50 years.
John, we're going to take a break.
Yeah.
Please stay with us. And when we come back, Jon Utley will tell us how he was able to visit the very concentration camp where his father was executed. And he'll share with us some of the things he learned when he visited Russia just 2 years ago. Please stay with us. There are many conservative organizations, but the Conservative Caucus is unique in that our standard for evaluating public policy is the Constitution of the United States. Our goal is to advocate policies which conform to what the Constitution stipulates and to oppose those which undermine the Constitution. It's clear that the federal government has only those powers which are provided in the Constitution, which were initially delegated by the states to the federal government or which were subsequently added by amendment. If we adhered to that principle, your taxes would be lower and your liberties would be more secure.
The Conservative Caucus, www.conservativeusa.org or 703-938-9626.
Face the Truth is a production of the Conservative Caucus and is seen twice monthly on the station you are watching. We will be interviewing the movers and shakers of the pro-life movement. We hope to educate and even inspire you about what is being done in our country to protect and to promote the sanctity of life. Please watch us.
Don't miss Face the Truth with Stephen Peroutka and Conservative Roundtable with Howard Phillips right here on this station every week.
Welcome back. I'm Howard Phillips, chairman of the Conservative Caucus, with my special guest, Jon Utley. John, it must have been thrilling for you to be able to go back and, as sad as it was, nonetheless learn more about the condition in which your father was situated, although you never knew your father. How did you get to the place where he was executed?
Well, my mother had received 2 postcards after he was arrested. That was all she ever knew. And then she never knew what happened. They never gave reasons. And later, through the former American ambassador, Llewellyn Thompson, who she knew, had asked the Russian officials what happened to my father. And it's about 20 years ago, a letter arrived from the Soviet embassy saying that he had died in Vorkuta, which is the northernmost concentration camp in the European part of Russia, right on the Arctic Ocean, 150 miles. And so we knew he died in Vorkuta. And then a friend of mine, a Russian, then started asking, you can go to the archives in Moscow and ask what happened to people. And the government has these records, and they've kept the records. And he found in the KGB, the former police library, the files. And then there was a man, a Russian colonel who was supervising it, who helped him, and he said there'd be other papers in Ukhtar. And Ukhtar was the concentration camp capital, administrative capital of the camps in Komi. Komi is an enormous state in northern Russia, as big as France, where many, many of the camps were. European Russia, just west of the Urals. And so he wrote to the place in Ukhtar, and then they sent other documents through the Russian embassy, which facilitated this, and we got them here. So then with that, we arranged, a friend of mine, a translator, Vladislav Krasnow, we went to Vorkuta by plane from Moscow, and Vorkuta was the northernmost camp. As I say, it was a town, the whole town was a concentration camp. Today there's still 100,000 people there. It's a mining, very rich veins of coal mining. And the camps were built in horrendous conditions. One of the first things that was slave labor was building the railroad. And in fact, I took that railroad back. When we left there, we went by rail and came back a long way. And it's above the tree line. Nothing grows. It's about the same latitude as Prudhoe Bay in Alaska, the coast of northern Alaska. And as I said, nothing grows. It's desolate country, and the mines were shallow underground mines. And anyway, that's where we had the documents from Peroutka, where my father died.
Different prisoners were treated differently. I recall you telling me that the German prisoners...
Well, the worst conditions were until 1940, when they started building these camps. And everyone died, and hardly anyone survived more than 2 or 3 years in the camps. And then later, the
starvation and cold.
Cold and hunger, absolutely. And it's a miserable way to die. And then later, the German prisoners of war were sent there, and they were treated a little better because they had value to trade back to Germany. And I should say, even before that, there was a large time they were sending women. They'd lost so many people had died. There were women during the Second World War who were late for their jobs in factories and stuff, could be shipped to the concentration camps. And many
so in
women,
other words, if they were tardy, the punishment would go to a concentration
camp. Yeah. And so anyway, many of course died. They couldn't do the hard work, the physical labor, and the terrible, one of the worst conditions in human history, and millions of people died in these camps. And I'd want to add to that, there is a museum. I went also to Perm, Vorkuta, and then we went on to Perm, is the only concentration camp museum in the whole of Russia, where it's still a camp like you see in the movies with the guard towers and so on. And they are having exhibits. The National Park Service is bringing them over, the museum.
The U.S.
National Park Service. There'll be exhibits in Ellis Island this summer for 3 months, and then in other major cities, Boston, Chicago, Atlanta, and then California. And that can, if one follows through at Ellis Island, we'll post that on, we have this website, FredaUtley.com, we'll post it there. But Ellis Island, by reaching there will be an exhibit of the camps, of the artifacts from the camps and pictures. It's very interesting, some of the pictures. When I visited the concentration camp in Perm, you see all these pictures of people adoring Stalin, like we see of Hitler as well. It's the same, very similar. And I asked the director, what do young Russians today think of that? And he said they can't believe that their parents or forebears would be cheering and everybody in lockstep. You know, the way a totalitarian
So today
country,
there is skepticism about Stalin among young Russians.
And we traveled through northern Russia, and you see statues and highways still called Lenin. To Lenin, you don't see anything of Stalin. The name just doesn't exist there.
What is your assessment of Russia's future?
Well, it's you know, the Russian people, when you go and you meet the people, they're so astounding. They're very well educated. The early education is superb in the first years, and people are so warm. And I would add, where we were in Vorkuta and other places, there's a Russian group called Memorial, Memorial, that are volunteers that are keeping track of the camps and are working on human rights in Russia. They make it an issue when there are violations. And then in another town called Syktyvkar, they are making their books are being published with the names of all the people who died in the camps, with a sentence or two about what happened. These records are there in the files, and the Soviet system was very, I said earlier, legalistic. Everything, you know.
Well, was there anything
like the Nazi, if you will?
Was there anything that surprised you when you visited the locus of your dad's elimination?
Well, it was so desolate, but the main thing we learned was that my father had been executed. We thought he died of starvation, hunger, and he'd actually been one of 3 leaders of a hunger strike in the concentration camps. And then he'd been executed in 1938 after 3 months in solitary confinement. 3 of them, actually 14 were executed, and he and 2 others were the leaders of a hunger strike in the camps. So when I think of that, the first thing one thinks is, well, would I rather die myself being shot or of hunger and cold? And I think being shot would be preferable.
More honorable.
And less painful. And then the fact that he did that, of course, is honorable, if you will.
So he was an heroic man.
Well, I mean...
he was a heroic man.
Yeah.
And...
I mean, it's a lot tougher in those places to fight against the government,
we
might say, than it is here.
Have you been, although it's getting tougher now, have you been able to trace your ancestry beyond your mother and father?
Well, partly my mother's side, I mentioned, was English socialist, and my father's side was Russian Jewish, and my father's grandfather had been a trader in Siberia years earlier, and so on.
Right.
Yeah, trader.
Well, you're anything but a socialist, John.
Well, absolutely.
You're one of the leading advocates of free market economics.
Yeah.
You're, like your mom, you're a strong anti-communist, and you've been a supporter of many worthy causes. And you've been willing to stand alone, as your dad did, against things that seem to be popular in the short term, but which in the perspective of history seem to be most misguided.
Well, it may be genetic, but also when I grew up, it was just, if I can say one, my mother would have friends coming to our house with these horrendous stories of communism, and yet the mass of the media during the Second World War was saying how wonderful communism was and how
Walter
Stalin,
Durante, the apologist for the New York Times.
And Life magazine, a whole issue devoted to Stalin's birthday, how wonderful communism was. So I grew up with a healthy skepticism of the common wisdom.
Of the media.
Yeah.
Well placed.
And,
we're going to have to take a break now. When we come back, we'll have about 2 minutes. Please stay with us, because Jon Utley will tell you how you can learn more about his life, about his experiences, about his perspective. Please stay with us. We'll be back right after these messages. Thank you.
When you see the terrible decline in public morality, do you have a suspicion that something's gone wrong in America? Would you like to make a positive difference for freedom and for liberty? Institute on the Constitution is a historical study designed to teach you about the basic core ideas behind the Constitution, the ideas that built America. Call the number on the screen and learn more.
The Institute on the Constitution, 410-768-2280, www.instituteontheconstitution.com.
There are many conservative organizations, but the Conservative Caucus is unique in that our standard for evaluating public policy is the Constitution of the United States. Our goal is to advocate policies which conform to what the Constitution stipulates and to oppose those which undermine the Constitution. It's clear that the federal government has only those powers which are provided in the Constitution, which were initially delegated by the states to the federal government, or which were subsequently added by amendment. If we adhered to that principle, your taxes would be lower and your liberties would be more secure.
The Conservative Caucus, www.conservativeusa.org or 703-938-9626.
Welcome back. I'm Howard Phillips, chairman of the Conservative Caucus, which sponsors Conservative Roundtable. If you're interested in more of the work of the Conservative Caucus, check out our website at www.conservativeusa.org or write to us at the Conservative Caucus, TCC, 450 Maple Avenue East in Vienna, V-I-E-N-N-A, Virginia, 22180. We'll be happy to send you more information about the work that we do. I'm sure you're as interested as I have been in what Jon Utley has been describing. All of us have much to learn from Jon's life, work, and experience. And if you want to get some of that and learn more about his famous mother and about Jon, contact him at FredaUtley.com.
Yeah.
And now we have about a minute left, Jon. What else is on your mind?
Well, I mean, I guess in these days I have to say, as an immigrant coming here, how great America is.
A legal immigrant.
Illegal. Well, we came on an overstayed a tourist visa.
Did you?
Yeah, back then, 1939. But how great this country is, and it's tragic to see what I think is happening with this so-called endless war. Endless war means the loss of one's freedoms, basically. And the other thing is, I come from Russia and all the misery, but people are not that different. Every society has its secret police types, including even ours. And I appreciate the Bill of Rights, and very opposed to the many measures in the Patriot Act. And I come out of having had my father arrested by secret police in the middle of the night, and that's impossible for Americans to comprehend. But
So far.
Well, but every society has the Germans had the secret police, the communists have, and we're not immune to all those
Jon,
things.
I wish we had hours to talk because you have much to tell us. Thanks so much for being with us, and thank you for joining us on Conservative Roundtable.